Jacob Thornton started building his curved metal shelter at his remote trapline camp in Wyoming Territory during autumn 1882, and when the few trappers who saw it passed word back to town, people laughed at what they called his barrel cabin and said no man could survive a Wyoming winter 40 miles from civilization in a metal tube barely big enough to lie down in, not just risky, suicidal. Because everyone knew that remote trapline camps required either a substantial log cabin for winter survival or regular trips back to town. What Jacob was building, a curved, corrugated iron shelter only 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, looked more like a storage shed or a culvert pipe than human winter shelter. A 34-year-old bachelor trapper planning to spend an entire winter alone in a metal tunnel in the wilderness, checking trap lines in brutal cold with his nearest neighbor 40 miles away. People didn't just think it would fail. They thought Jacob would be found frozen to death come spring, killed by his own foolish construction choice. Jacob Thornton smiled quietly in his thick beard and kept bolting iron sheets to curved wooden ribs. Jacob was an experienced Montana and Wyoming trapper who'd worked trap lines for 12 years. He'd spent those years learning that conventional trapline camps had a fundamental problem. They required massive amounts of firewood to stay warm, but gathering firewood took time away from checking traps, and time away from traps meant lost income. A typical trapline cabin, even a small one, needed constant feeding of a large stove to maintain survivable temperatures during Wyoming winters. Jacob had calculated that in a normal 12 by 16 cabin, he spent approximately 4 hours daily just gathering, splitting, and hauling firewood during deep winter. That was 4 hours he couldn't spend checking his 30-mile trap line, which meant animals sitting in traps longer, which meant damaged pelts and lost profit. Jacob had also learned that large cabins at remote camps were targets. Other trappers, desperate men passing through, even hostile groups would sometimes break into or burn remote cabins out of spite or to eliminate competition. A large, visible cabin advertised occupation and resources. What Jacob wanted was a shelter that required minimal wood, heated efficiently, was difficult to spot from a distance, and could be locked securely when he was out checking traps for days at a time. The solution came to him while watching railroad workers unload curved corrugated iron sheets intended for a culvert project. The half-cylinder metal tubes created for water drainage were incredibly strong, weatherproof, and required no maintenance. What if he built something similar for shelter? Jacob bought 40 sheets of corrugated iron from a salvage dealer for $18, metal that had been rejected from a construction project for minor defects. Each sheet was 8 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. If he curved them over a wooden frame to create a tunnel shape, he could build a shelter that was long enough to lie down in, wide enough to move around, and completely enclosed in weatherproof metal. When he explained this plan to Samuel Green, a fellow trapper who worked nearby territories, the reaction was immediate concern. "Jacob, you're planning to winter in a metal tunnel. That's not a cabin. That's barely adequate for storing equipment. You'll freeze to death 40 miles from help. The small size means I heat it efficiently with minimal wood. The curved metal sheds snow and wind, and it's invisible from a distance, which means nobody bothers it when I'm out on trapline. Metal conducts cold. You'll have frost forming inside while you sleep. And the size, 12 feet by 8 feet. That's 96 square feet. Jacob, that's smaller than most people's storage sheds. You can't live in that for an entire winter." "I don't need living space. I need sleeping space, cooking space, and equipment storage. 96 square feet is adequate if I'm only there to sleep and prepare for trapline work." Samuel shook his head slowly. "Even if you somehow survive the cold, you're 40 miles from town in a metal tube. If you get injured, if you run into problems, if something goes wrong, Jacob, you're choosing isolation in inadequate shelter. That's how trappers die. Conventional trapline cabins mean I spend half my time gathering wood instead of working traps. This shelter lets me focus on trapping, not survival." But Samuel's reaction was typical. When word reached town that Jacob Thornton was building a curved metal tunnel at his remote trapline camp and planning to winter there, the response was mockery mixed with genuine predictions of death. "Thornton's built himself a coffin," one trapper said at the trading post. "Come spring, we'll find him frozen in that metal barrel." "Man thinks he's smarter than everyone who came before," another added. "Conventional cabins work. His metal tunnel will kill him." Jacob heard the predictions secondhand and ignored them. He had work to do. Building the curved shelter was physically demanding but straightforward. Jacob started by creating a wooden platform 12 feet long and 8 feet wide using rough-cut lumber. Then he built curved ribs, bent saplings forming half circles, every 2 feet along the platform's length, creating the skeleton of a tunnel. The corrugated iron sheets attached to these ribs, overlapping slightly, bolted together to create a continuous weatherproof skin. Jacob worked methodically, bending each sheet to match the curve, drilling holes for bolts, securing everything tightly. The work took 3 weeks of steady labor. The result looked exactly like what people said: a metal barrel lying on its side, a half-cylinder of corrugated iron 12 feet long and 8 feet wide at the base, about 6 feet tall at the peak where the curve reached its highest point. Not a cabin, not a conventional structure, just a curved metal tunnel sitting in a clearing in the Wyoming wilderness. Jacob built wooden end walls to close the tunnel's open faces. The front end got a small door and a window. The back end got a smaller vent window for air circulation. He installed a tiny sheet metal stove, barely 18 inches square, near one end, with a stovepipe extending through the metal roof. Inside, the curved space was tight but functional. Jacob built a narrow sleeping platform along one side. Storage shelves along the other side held his trapping equipment, food supplies, and gear. A small area near the stove provided space for cooking and equipment maintenance. The curved walls meant he couldn't stand fully upright except in the center, but for a trapline camp, where he'd primarily sleep and prepare for work, standing room wasn't critical. The interior challenge was insulation. Jacob knew corrugated metal would conduct outside temperature directly inside unless he created a barrier. He lined the entire interior with layered canvas and wool blankets, creating a 2-inch insulation layer between the metal shell and the living space. This layer would prevent direct cold conduction while still allowing the metal's structural benefits. By early November, the shelter was complete. From a distance, it was nearly invisible. The curved metal blended into the landscape, looking more like a natural rock formation or fallen tree than human construction. Up close, it looked bizarre and inadequate. Jacob moved in on November 8th, stocking the shelter with supplies for winter: dried meat, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, trapping equipment, and a modest supply of split firewood. His plan was to check his 30-mile trap line every 4 to 5 days, spending 1 or 2 nights out at distant camps, then returning to the metal shelter as his base. The first serious test came in late November, when temperature dropped to 8 below zero for 2 nights. Jacob lit his tiny stove with a small fire. 3 pieces of split wood, not the arm-load conventional cabins required. Within 20 minutes, the curved metal shelter was 62 degrees and comfortable. He realized something remarkable. The curved metal walls, once warmed by interior air, reflected heat back inward instead of letting it escape. The small volume, only about 450 cubic feet compared to a conventional cabin's 2,000-plus cubic feet, heated almost instantly with minimal fuel. And the insulation layer prevented the cold metal exterior from conducting freezing temperatures inside. Jacob used approximately 1/4 the firewood he'd burned in conventional trapline cabins. This meant he could gather a week's worth of wood in one afternoon instead of gathering daily, which freed enormous amounts of time for actual trapping work. But Jacob didn't tell anyone. He wanted winter to truly test the shelter before making claims. That extreme test came in January 1883, when a massive blizzard struck Wyoming territory with a violence that would kill people and animals across the region. It started January 10th, as light snow. Jacob was out checking the southern section of his trapline, 20 miles from his curved metal shelter, staying at a small emergency camp he maintained, just a lean-to with a fire pit. By evening, it was a full blizzard. Wind howled through the trees with sustained violence. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to arm's length. Temperature plummeted to 26 below zero and continued falling. Jacob faced a critical decision: stay at the inadequate lean-to and likely freeze, or attempt the 20-mile journey back to his metal shelter through a blizzard in darkness. He chose to move. The lean-to offered almost no protection from wind, and without substantial firewood, which he couldn't gather in blizzard conditions, he'd freeze by morning. The metal shelter, if he could reach it, offered genuine protection. The journey became a fight for survival. Jacob navigated by feel and memory, following the trapline route he'd traveled hundreds of times. The blizzard was so intense he couldn't see landmarks. Wind knocked him down twice. Snow accumulated so fast his snowshoes could barely stay on top. Temperature dropped to 30 below, then 32 below. 15 miles into the journey, Jacob realized he was experiencing early hypothermia. His thinking was getting slow. His fingers had lost feeling despite heavy mittens. He kept moving only through stubborn determination and the knowledge that stopping meant death. After 7 hours of brutal travel, a journey that normally took 4 hours, Jacob reached his clearing and nearly missed his own shelter. The curved metal structure was almost completely buried under snowdrifts, invisible except for the stovepipe protruding from the white mound like a lone chimney emerging from nowhere. Jacob's mind, slowed by hypothermia and exhaustion, struggled to process what he was seeing. He'd expected to see the shelter's outline, the door, some recognizable feature. Instead, there was just a massive snow mound with a small metal pipe sticking out. He stumbled toward the pipe, using it as a landmark, and began digging at where he remembered the door being. His hands, even in thick mittens, had almost no sensation. His fingers wouldn't bend properly. He scooped snow with his arms like crude shovels, working frantically because he knew stopping meant freezing to death within sight of shelter. The snow was dense from wind compression. Jacob dug for what felt like an eternity, probably only 10 minutes, before his arm broke through into empty darkness. He'd found the door recess. He cleared enough space to squeeze his body through, pushed the door open, and literally fell inside onto the floor. For several minutes, Jacob just lay there in the darkness, shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. His entire body hurt. His face felt like wood, numb and stiff. His feet had no sensation at all. His hands couldn't grip anything. His thinking was foggy and slow. He knew these were hypothermia symptoms. He knew he needed heat immediately, but his body wasn't responding to commands properly. With immense effort, Jacob crawled to where he'd stored firewood and kindling. His hands couldn't grasp individual pieces, so he used his arms to scrape wood toward the stove. He found his fire-starting kit by touch in the darkness, flint, steel, char cloth, and spent precious minutes trying to make his frozen fingers work well enough to strike sparks. The first attempt failed. His hands shook too badly to aim properly. The second attempt produced sparks, but they missed the char cloth. The third attempt worked. A tiny ember glowed in the char cloth. Jacob transferred it to a nest of dry grass and birch bark with shaking hands, blew on it gently, and watched a small flame grow. He fed the flame carefully, small twigs first, then slightly larger pieces, building the fire slowly because his coordination was too impaired to do it quickly. When he finally had a sustainable fire, he opened the tiny stove door and transferred the burning material inside. Then he added wood, just a few split pieces, and closed the stove door. And waited. What happened next demonstrated why the curved metal shelter's design was so revolutionary. Within 5 minutes, Jacob could feel warmth beginning to radiate from the stove. Within 10 minutes, the air temperature in the shelter had risen noticeably, from maybe 10 degrees to 30 degrees. Within 15 minutes, it was 45 degrees. The transformation was shocking. The tiny stove, burning maybe 3 small pieces of wood, was heating the 450 cubic feet of shelter space faster than a massive fireplace could heat a 2,000 cubic foot cabin. By 20 minutes, the interior was 55 degrees. Jacob's shaking began to subside slightly. His thinking cleared a fraction. By 30 minutes, the shelter was 65 degrees and genuinely warm. Jacob stripped off his frozen outer layers with hands that were starting to function again. His coat was solid ice from condensed breath and snow. His pants were frozen stiff. His boots had ice formations on them. He wrapped himself in dry blankets and lay on his sleeping platform near the stove. Feeling sensation gradually returned to his extremities with the painful burning of returning circulation. His toes hurt terribly as they warmed, a sharp, burning pain that meant tissue damage but not catastrophic frostbite. His fingers went through the same painful warming. His face tingled and burned as frozen tissue came back to life. Jacob understood, lying there in pain as his body recovered, that he'd come very close to death. If the shelter had been farther away, if it had taken longer to heat, if he'd been too hypothermic to start the fire, any of these factors would have killed him. But the curved metal shelter's efficiency had saved him. The rapid heating from minimal fuel had brought him back from the edge of hypothermia quickly enough to prevent serious tissue damage. He fed the stove occasionally through the night, adding 1 or 2 pieces of wood every few hours, and the shelter maintained 65 to 70 degrees effortlessly. By morning, Jacob felt mostly recovered, though his toes and fingers were still tender and his overall exhaustion was profound. The blizzard continued through January 11th, 12th and 13th. For 3 full days, Jacob was trapped in the shelter, while the storm raged outside. Temperature stayed at 28 to 32 below the entire time. Wind velocity was high enough that Jacob could hear it screaming around the snow mound that encased his shelter, but the sound was muffled, filtered through both the snow and the metal shell. Jacob spent those days in relative comfort. He melted snow for water, cooked simple meals on his tiny stove, maintained the fire at low levels and rested. The shelter stayed consistently warm, 68 to 72 degrees depending on how much wood he burned. The snow burial had actually improved the shelter's performance. The thick snow layer added insulation, creating an igloo effect. The metal structure at the core held heat, the insulation layer prevented cold conduction, and the outer snow layer provided additional protection from wind and temperature. Jacob calculated his wood consumption, approximately 6 small pieces per day to maintain full comfort. In a conventional cabin, maintaining similar temperatures during the same conditions would have required burning 1/3 of a cord per day, roughly 50 times more wood. On January 14th, the wind finally stopped. Jacob dug his way out through the snow mound, now compressed and icy from the storm, and emerged into a transformed landscape. Snow drifts reached 15 feet in some places. Trees were snapped or bent at severe angles under ice load. The entire Wyoming wilderness looked like a different world, white, desolate, and deadly beautiful. Jacob's curved metal shelter, mostly buried, had survived completely intact. No damage, no structural stress. The snow that had nearly hidden it had actually protected it. Jacob spent the next week carefully checking his trapline. The work was brutal, breaking trail through deep snow, finding traps buried under drifts, processing frozen animals. But he was alive and functional, which put him ahead of many people. When he returned to town on January 22nd to sell pelts and resupply, the reaction was profound. The trading post was crowded with trappers and townspeople, many showing signs of the blizzard's impact. Samuel Green was there with bandaged feet. He'd lost 3 toes to frostbite. Thomas Morrison had burns on his hands from desperately trying to maintain fire. William Parker looked gaunt and traumatized. "Jacob," Samuel stared. "My God, you're alive! We were certain. Everyone said you'd be found dead in spring in that metal barrel." "The shelter worked, Samuel. Worked better than I'd hoped." "How?" "I lost toes because my cabin couldn't stay warm despite burning everything I owned. You're telling me you survived 40 miles out in that metal tube?" Jacob explained the blizzard's survival, the 20-mile journey in lethal conditions, the hypothermia, the rapid heating that saved his life, the 3 days of comfort while the storm raged. The crowd at the trading post listened in silence. These were hard men who understood survival. They recognized truth when they heard it. Marcus Webb, the trading post owner, spoke carefully. "Jacob, you're saying that during the worst blizzard in memory, your curved metal shelter maintained 70 degrees using minimal wood, while conventional buildings in town were barely reaching 50 degrees despite massive fires." "That's accurate, Marcus. The shelter's small volume and curved heat reflection make it dramatically more efficient than conventional construction. 3 people died in town from cold-related causes during that blizzard," Marcus said quietly. "Died in conventional houses with family caring for them. And you survived alone in the wilderness, in a shelter everyone called inadequate. Jacob, you've proven something important about how we build." Samuel removed his boot to show his bandaged foot. "I built my trapline cabin the way everyone said was proper. Good logs, tight chinking, large fireplace. I did everything conventional wisdom said to do, and I lost toes because conventional wisdom is wrong about heating efficiency." Over the following days, Jacob found himself repeatedly explaining the curved metal shelter's design and principles. How the corrugated iron sheets curved over ribs created the tunnel shape. How the small volume heated with minimal fuel. How the curved metal reflected heat inward instead of letting it escape through flat surfaces. How proper insulation prevented cold conduction from the metal exterior. Some listeners were immediately convinced and wanted to build similar shelters. Others remained skeptical. Surely this was unique circumstances. Surely there were hidden problems. Surely conventional cabins were still superior overall. But Thomas Morrison, who'd built a conventional trapline cabin at significant expense and nearly died in it during the blizzard, was ready to try something different. "Jacob, can you help me build one of these curved shelters? I can't spend another winter in a cabin that nearly killed me." "Yes, but Thomas, the size is critical. Too large and you lose the heating efficiency. The shelter needs to be compact, 12 by 8 feet maximum. That's smaller than my current cabin storage room. It's smaller than conventional living space, yes, but it's adequate for sleeping and basic camp functions, and it keeps you alive when conventional cabins fail." Through spring and summer 1883, Jacob helped 4 trappers build curved metal shelters at their remote camps. He taught them the key principles: keep the size compact, use proper curved ribs, insulate the interior, install a small, efficient stove. Not all the attempts succeeded perfectly. William Parker built his shelter without adequate insulation and found it conducted cold badly until he added proper lining. Thomas Morrison initially built his too large, 14 by 12 feet, and had to rebuild smaller to achieve proper efficiency. But by winter 1883-1884, 5 trappers in the region were using curved metal shelters successfully. All reported the same experiences: dramatic reduction in wood gathering time, superior heating efficiency, better storm protection, and the ability to maintain comfort in conditions that made conventional cabins barely adequate. The economic impact for these trappers was measurable. Jacob calculated that over the 1882-1883 winter, his curved shelter saved him approximately 320 hours of wood gathering time compared to conventional cabin operation. That was nearly 2 full weeks of time he could devote to trapping instead of survival labor. His pelt production increased by approximately 18% because he could spend more time actually working his trapline, and his wood costs, critical for trappers operating far from free firewood sources, dropped to less than a quarter of what conventional cabins required. By 1886, the curved metal shelter design was established among Wyoming and Montana trappers as a legitimate alternative to conventional cabins for remote seasonal camps. The structures were called various names: trapline barrels, Thornton tubes, curved camps, but the design was consistent: corrugated iron over curved ribs, compact size, proper insulation, small stove. The shelter's advantages extended beyond just heating efficiency. The curved metal exterior was virtually indestructible. It didn't rot, insects couldn't damage it, and fire couldn't burn it. Trappers reported shelters lasting 10 to 15 years, with zero maintenance beyond occasional re-insulation of the interior. The compact size had security advantages. Conventional trapline cabins were targets for theft or vandalism. Jacob's curved shelter, nearly invisible when snow-covered and small enough that it looked like equipment storage rather than living quarters, was largely ignored by anyone passing through the area. The rapid heating was crucial for emergency survival situations. Multiple trappers reported experiences similar to Jacob's blizzard survival, arriving at the shelter exhausted or hypothermic and being able to achieve life-saving warmth within minutes rather than the hour-plus that conventional cabins required. Jacob Thornton continued using his curved metal shelter for trapline work until 1891, when he was 43 and decided to transition away from the brutal physical demands of wilderness trapping. By that point, the shelter had served him through 9 Wyoming winters, saving him thousands of hours of wood gathering and likely saving his life at least twice during severe storms. The shelter remained at the trapline camp, used by subsequent trappers who worked the territory. Records from the Wyoming Trappers Association indicate the structure was still functional as late as 1907, 25 years after Jacob built it, before finally being abandoned when the trapline territory changed ownership and the new owner built a conventional cabin. What Jacob had created, like Emma Hartley's schoolteacher cabin, was an accidental precursor to the Quonset hut. The same principles that made Jacob's shelter efficient in 1882 would be formalized into military engineering specifications in 1941. Curved corrugated metal over ribs, creating a half-cylinder structure that was quick to build, efficient to heat, structurally strong, and weatherproof. Jacob built his version 59 years early, solving a practical trapper's problem without knowing he was pioneering a design that would later shelter millions of military personnel in every climate on Earth. A photograph from 1888 shows Jacob standing in front of his curved metal shelter at the trapline camp. The half-cylinder shape is clearly visible, 12 feet of corrugated metal forming a perfect tunnel. Snow is banked against it, and the tiny stovepipe protrudes from the curve. Jacob, then 40, looks weathered and competent, a man who'd found a solution that worked and stuck with it. A journal entry from Samuel Green in 1884 described visiting Jacob's trapline camp, entered Thornton's metal barrel shelter with skepticism, exited convinced, "I've been doing everything wrong for 12 years. The shelter maintains warmth I cannot achieve in my cabin, despite using a fraction of my wood consumption. Jacob's curved tunnel that we all mocked has proven superior to conventional trapline construction in every measurable way." Jacob Thornton built a curved metal mini-cabin when everyone laughed at his barrel shelter and predicted he'd freeze to death. They mocked the Quonset-style design 59 years before Quonset huts were invented. They said metal would conduct cold, and the tiny size would be impossible to heat, and he'd die in the wilderness in an inadequate shelter. Then the blizzard came, with 32 below cold and 4 days of deadly wind, and Jacob survived near hypothermia because his curved metal shelter heated from near freezing to life-saving warmth in 30 minutes using 3 pieces of wood. While conventional cabins in town failed and people died despite massive fires, while Samuel lost toes to frostbite in a proper trapline cabin, Jacob maintained 70 degrees in a metal tunnel buried under snow 40 miles from civilization. The shelter everyone called a coffin saved his life. The tiny stove, they said, couldn't heat the space, outperformed massive fireplaces. The curved metal walls that were supposed to conduct cold instead reflected heat inward with remarkable efficiency. Jacob didn't know he was accidentally recreating a design the military would later formalize. He just knew he needed efficient shelter that freed time for actual trapping work instead of constant wood gathering. He used his curved metal shelter for 9 years and saved thousands of hours compared to conventional cabin operation. The structure stood for 25 years total, outlasting many conventional log cabins. But Jacob Thornton's accidental innovation proved something important. Sometimes a trapper trying to work more efficiently can build something that works better than conventional solutions, costing 3 times as much. The curved metal shelter everyone called a death trap kept Jacob warm through 9 Wyoming winters, and likely saved his life at least twice during severe storms. And the Quonset-style design Jacob pioneered in 1882 wouldn't be officially invented until 1941, proof that good engineering principles transcend time when someone practical enough applies them. Jacob Thornton knew that in 1882. It took one deadly blizzard for everyone else to learn it. The Trading Post owner, Marcus Webb, wanted details. "Jacob, people are saying your metal shelter outperformed conventional buildings during the blizzard. Is that true?" "It's true. Small volume heats efficiently. Curved metal reflects warmth inward. I used maybe 1/10 of the wood. Conventional structures required and maintained warmer temperatures." "And you built it for what cost?" "About $25 in materials. Mostly the corrugated iron sheets and some lumber for framing." Marcus did calculations on paper. A conventional trapline cabin costs at least $80 in materials and weeks of labor. Your shelter cost 1/4 that much and works better? For a single person who needs shelter rather than living space, yes, it works better. The implications were profound for trappers and anyone working in remote locations. Jacob's curved metal shelter demonstrated that efficient design could outperform conventional construction at a fraction of the cost. Not everyone who tried to replicate Jacob's design succeeded. Thomas Morrison built a curved metal shelter but made it too large, 16 feet by 12 feet, and lost the heating efficiency advantage. William Parker built his shelter without proper insulation, and the metal conducted cold badly. But those who followed Jacob's specific design, curved corrugated iron over ribs, compact size around 12 by 8 feet, proper insulation layer, tiny efficient stove, built shelters that worked excellently for remote camps and seasonal work. By 1885, 11 trappers in the Wyoming and Montana region had built curved metal shelters based on Jacob's design. All reported dramatic improvements in heating efficiency, reduced wood gathering time, and better protection during storms. The structures became known as trapline barrels, or Thornton tubes, among the trapping community. The economic impact for trappers was substantial. Jacob calculated that his curved shelter saved him approximately 8 hours per week in wood gathering, compared to conventional cabins. That was 8 more hours for checking traps, processing pelts, and maintaining equipment. Over a winter season, that translated to approximately 15 to 20% more productivity.